interesting thing about Roseto, and we're probably talking about the 1950s. There was a gentleman named Stuart Wolf, and Stuart was a doctor and also a medical professor at the University of Oklahoma. He had virtually not seen anybody from Roseto over the age of 65 who died of a heart attack or even had any kind of signs of heart disease. So Wolf decided he would actually conduct a full-blown study. They invited the entire town to participate in a medical study. And they took blood, they did EKGs, they took a history of these people to try to explain how it could be that they had no heart disease.
The Roseto study was to try to understand, why is it that this town is unique? Is it something in the water? Is it something in the environment and culture? Is it something with the diet? Is it in the genes? They had no idea what caused this longevity.
I did work with the group, Dr. Wolf and his group. I helped them out. And if you want to know a little bit about we worked at Columbus School. They had us in sections. EKG, blood tests, and weight, and interviews. And I worked with the EKG at the time. We learned a lot about our hometown that we didn't think was so great, and they made us famous, I guess. But it was a wonderful experience.
So given this history, the findings were that beyond the health issues, there was no suicide in Roseto, no alcoholism, no drug abuse, virtually no crime, no one on welfare, and they couldn't even find anybody with a peptic ulcer. So they were incredibly healthy people. What
they didn't, what they saw a lot of healthy people. The men and women were all overweight. They really were, and they couldn't understand how come we didn't have all the heart attacks because of our weight.
So they conducted all these tests to try to explain away this lack of heart disease. The interesting thing was they first thought it had to be related to their diet because they were, from a Mediterranean region, and they figured, well, they must have a nice, healthy diet. But it was quite the contrary. When these Rosetons came from Italy to America, they weren't cooking with olive oil, they were cooking with lard. They were very heavy smokers. Many of them were obese. They ate lots of sweets.
The diet consisted primarily of an animal fat diet, which I still do today. If you ask me how I make my, quote, gravy or tomato sauce with meatballs, it's fried in lard. And the lard drippings are put into the tomato sauce and stirred in for flavor.
Oh, my father had to have his bottle of wine at the table every dinner time, and he drank, and we also drank some too.
So it was really inexplicable to try to figure out how this lack of heart disease existed with people who were basically doing everything wrong. So after, not being able to explain it by diet, they thought, well, it's got to be genetics. It's got to be they're just from very hardy stock in Europe. So then they decided, well, you know what, let's test some Rosetons from outside of the city of Roseto, the borough of Roseto. Because others had moved to Easton and other parts of Pennsylvania. They did the same thing, conducted these studies, and lo and behold, these others from Roseto who were not actually living in the borough, their heart attack rates and their incidence of heart disease was triple that of the Rosetons. So now they're really baffled. What explains this? Maybe it's related to the community of Roseto itself. I mean, these people literally were only dying of old age. And it wasn't just heart disease. Their incidence of death for all other causes of death was also about 3 times lower than it was generally in the United States. Heart attacks were an epidemic in the 50s. So he started interviewing these people and examining how they live. And it became very apparent that their sense of community was so different than everyone else.
We were all family oriented. The Italians seemed to to look after each other.
The atmosphere in the town was easygoing. Everyone knew each other. And surprisingly, if you asked any number of people who lived here during that time period, we rarely locked our homes. We rarely, because we had no fear of break-ins.
So I think in the Roseto story, between the family values and the culture and the fact that as one got older, there was little stress because they were surrounded by their family, that there was abundance of food because there was also farming done at the local areas, such that you weren't without.
They really had taken their little village of Roseto Valtafotore and transferred it to the United States. They continued to speak Italian, and not just Italian, they spoke their Foggian dialect.
Italy is such a unique country in Europe. It's like right on the cusp of like Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Africa. So it's like the perfect melting pot of like, you know, all these ethnic identities.
Many houses was 3 and 4 generations of people living together. You know, they had an unbelievable respect for grandparents and great-grandparents. They, you know, when they walked down the street, they stopped and talked to their neighbors. It was a town of only 2,000 people. They had 22 social organizations. So they had this unbelievable sense of community, and Brune started to explain that the only explanation for this lack of this high incidence of heart disease has to be the community itself.
It was our way of living more than anything else.
It was what they say, a la familia, the family. Roseto was one big happy community. We were almost everybody was related to each other. And you wouldn't hesitate to help anybody. Like they said, you knew your neighbors, both behind you, in front of you, across the street, wherever. And all they had to do was say, hey, I need help, and the whole neighborhood was there to help. One instance of that is that every year, the old timers, they always raised their pigs, and they would butcher their pigs. So it would be one day was the house up the street, the next day was the house next door, the next day was yours, and all the way down the line. And everybody, all the families just came together and they helped everybody. When it came time to make wine, everybody helped pick the grapes, everybody helped squash the grapes, everybody watched them, and then it was time to bottle, everybody was there to help. It was a big family.
And nobody was stressed out. When I was growing up, my parents were never stressed.
We were happy, and I think that's the main thing.
But as time wore on, from the 60s into the 70s, we found that the Roseto effect began to lose its luster.
I think what happened to Roseto was we became Americanized. Most of the parents worked hard to make sure their kids got a good education. As a result of that education, we had no place to work around here. So they had to move out of town. Their parents were passing away, the homes were going up for sale. The Americanization, again, brought other people into the borough. Now you didn't know your neighbor. Hey, I need help. Hopefully there was a family member in town that could come and help you, because you couldn't count on the neighbors anymore. That family effect was gone, and that's what's happening today.
Roseto was no longer that close-knit community that it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. It became Americanized. Yes, we did suffer fewer heart conditions than other communities, but over time, people realized that there were things that they probably wanted that they didn't have, that now they felt that they needed to get. A better home, a newer car, a higher social status, and that somewhat, in my opinion, broke down the social structure to some degree. And secondly, what precipitated that, I think, was that the original residents of Roseto aged, passed away, homes were left to children who no longer wanted them, and then they were sold to people who lived outside the community. And now they became rental apartments or rental housing. And we had an influx of those people from outside of our community who were not aware of or engendered with or embraced the community as we did as children and as lifelong residents. And that contributed, I think, to the losing of the luster of that Roseto effect of the close-knit society, the helping one another.
Well, I think, I think Roseto is still a great little town. And as long as I'm mayor, I'm going to try to keep it that way. It's a great place to visit, but it's also a great place to live, and it's a great place to raise a family. So come and see us.